So, this all happened during my very first overnight shift. I'd just gotten my nursing license and landed a job at Serenity Meadows Care Home. It sounded nice, right? Serenity. It was one of those places that's not quite a hospital, but a step up from just an old folks' home. Mostly for patients who needed round-the-clock observation. I was on the night rotation, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. on the second floor, the wing they called the memory care unit. A gentle way of saying it was for the patients whose minds were, fading. To be honest, I was a little nervous, but mostly just determined to do a good job. The nurse I was taking over for, a tired-looking woman named Brenda, gave me a quick rundown. It was usually dead quiet. Just do your rounds, check the charts, and try not to fall asleep, she'd said, giving me a weak smile. The coffee in the break room is sludge, but it has caffeine. That's all that matters. And she was right. For the first 3 hours, it was exactly that, quiet. Eerily quiet. You don't realize how loud silence can be until you're the only person awake in a building full of sleeping people. The only sounds were the ones that seemed to make the silence even deeper. There was the low, constant hum of the industrial air conditioning, a sound you only noticed when it occasionally clicked off for a second, leaving a total, unnerving vacuum of noise. And then there was the big, old clock hanging behind the nurse's station. It had this slow, deliberate tick-tock that seemed to be measuring my life in agonizingly slow increments. Tick, check a file, talk, take a sip of the sludgy coffee. The hallway stretched out in front of me, long, dim corridor lit by these little nightlights spaced about 20 feet apart. They cast a weak, yellowish glow that didn't so much illuminate the hall as it did create long, deep shadows that my tired eyes kept trying to turn into shapes. I was sitting at the station, a wide, U-shaped desk right in the middle of the wing's nexus, where two hallways met. It was about 2 in the morning. I'd done my first round, checked on everyone. All were sleeping soundly, a chorus of soft snores and occasional murmurs from behind closed doors. Now, I was just trying to get through the paperwork, updating the digital charts, reviewing the next day's medication schedules. It was boring, methodical work, and the heavy, warm air of the building was starting to lull me into a stupor. My eyelids felt like they had little weights attached to them. I was in that zone, that professional but half-asleep state. Everything was normal, everything was under control. That's when it happened. The silence was shattered by a sound so sharp and piercing it made me physically jolt in my chair, slopping a little bit of coffee onto a stack of paperwork. It was the call button. A high-pitched, insistent beep, 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 that cut through the quiet like a knife. I looked up at the panel above the desk. A little red light was flashing next to the number, 204. I took a deep breath, my heart thumping a little faster than it should have been. It was just a patient needing something. Water, help to the bathroom, maybe a bad dream. This was the job. I stood up, smoothing out my scrubs, and started the walk down the long, dim hallway. The sound of my own soft-soled shoes squeaking on the polished linoleum seemed ridiculously loud now. Room 204, the little plaque on the door read, Mrs. Lanchester. I'd read her file earlier. 87 years old, severe Alzheimer's, progressing rapidly. The notes said she was mostly nonverbal, prone to confusion and agitation, especially at night. Sundowning, they called it. Classic case. I pushed the door open gently. Mrs. Lanchester? I whispered, not wanting to wake her roommate. It's Anne, the nurse. You rang your call button? The room was dark, except for the faint moonlight filtering through the window and a single, tiny nightlight plugged into the wall outlet near the floor. I could see her silhouette. She wasn't lying down. She was sitting bolt upright on the edge of her bed, her thin hospital gown making her look frail and small. Her back was mostly to me. She didn't seem to be looking at the door or the window, or anything you'd expect. She was staring, completely motionless, into the darkest corner of the room, the one by the wardrobe where the shadows were thickest. Mrs. Lanchester, are you all right? I said, taking a step further into the room. She didn't turn around or acknowledge me at all. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something. It was a little creepy, I'll admit. The notes said she could be unresponsive, so I just chalked it up to that. I walked over to the side of her bed and put a hand gently on her shoulder. It's okay, ma'am. You're safe, I said in my most soothing, professional voice. Did you have a bad dream? That's when she moved. She turned her head, slowly, like an old rusty machine. But her eyes, they weren't foggy or confused like I expected. They were sharp. clear, and they locked right onto mine with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. She reached out with a surprisingly strong, bony hand and grabbed my forearm. Her skin was like paper, but her grip was firm. And then she spoke. Her voice wasn't the mumble I'd read about in her chart. It was a low, clear, perfectly articulate whisper. It was the kind of clarity that feels completely out of place, and 100 times more unsettling than any confused babbling. She leaned in a little closer, her gaze never leaving my face. "Nurse," she said, each word perfectly formed. "Have you fed the shadow in the corner yet?" I just stared at her. For a second, my brain just stopped. The question was so bizarre, so specific, and delivered with such unnerving sanity. I could feel my professional composure starting to crack. The shadow in the corner. I couldn't help but flick my eyes over to the corner she'd been staring at. It was just a corner. Empty, a deep patch of black where the light didn't reach. But for a split second, my sleep-deprived brain played a trick on me. The shadow seemed to deepen, to coalesce, almost as if it had substance. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. A trick of a tired mind listening to a confused old woman. I forced a smile, patting her hand gently. "Oh, Mrs. Lanchester," I said, my voice a little higher than I wanted it to be. "There's no one there, sweetie. You were probably just dreaming." I let go of her hand and walked over to the corner, making a show of it. I reached out and touched the cool, painted wall. "See? Nothing here." I then walked over to the wall lamp between the two beds and flicked it on. The room was flooded with a soft, warm light, chasing all the shadows away. The corner was just a corner. An empty one. See? All gone. It was just a trick of the dark. I turned back to her, expecting her to look relieved, or maybe just confused again. But she didn't. Her expression hadn't changed. That clear, intense look was still in her eyes. She wasn't looking at the corner anymore, though. She was looking at me. And she just slowly, almost imperceptibly, shook her head. "You should really give it something," she whispered again, just as clearly as before. "It gets hungry." A real chill went down my spine then. I told myself it was textbook. Hallucinations, paranoid delusions. Her file was full of it. This was my job, to handle this calmly. "Okay, Mrs. Lanchester," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "How about we get you tucked back in? I'll make sure all the shadows are well fed and stay away for the rest of the night. How does that sound?" I was trying to play along, to soothe her. It's a technique they teach you. Don't argue with the delusion, just redirect. I helped her lie back down and pulled the thin blanket up to her chin. Her eyes finally started to get that distant, foggy look again. The moment of strange clarity was over. She was slipping back into the fog of her disease. Within a minute, her breathing evened out, and she seemed to be asleep. I turned off the lamp, plunging the room back into near darkness, and quietly slipped out, closing the door behind me. I walked back down the hallway, the squeak of my shoes sounding nervous now. I got back to the nurse's station and sank into my chair. My heart was still beating too fast. I picked up my cold coffee and took a long drink, the bitter taste doing nothing to calm me. It was just the disease. That's all it was, a textbook case of sundowning, manifesting as a very specific, very vivid hallucination. I'd seen weirder things during my clinicals. I'd heard patients talk to people who weren't there 100 times. But I'd never heard it like that. Never with that certainty. That sudden, shocking switch from a confused old woman to someone giving a clear, rational-sounding warning. It wasn't the words themselves that got to me. It was the delivery. It was the look in her eyes. It was the strength in her hand when she grabbed my arm. I tried to go back to the charts, to focus on the numbers and the medical terminology on the screen. But I couldn't. Her whispered words just kept replaying in my head. "Have you fed the shadow in the corner yet?" Against my will, my eyes kept drifting from the computer screen to the end of the long, dark hallway. To the places where the weak lights didn't quite reach. To the patches of deep, impenetrable shadow. And I couldn't shake the feeling, the cold, stupid, completely irrational feeling, that something was looking back. I spent the next half hour trying to get my head straight. You have to understand, in that kind of job, you compartmentalize. You have to. You see things, hear things. People in the grip of dementia can be in a different reality altogether. A reality that can be terrifying for them, and honestly, a little unsettling for you. But it's part of the job description. You document it, you soothe them, and you move on. So that's what I did. Or at least, I tried to. I sat back at the nurse's station, the big clock on the wall ticking away the seconds with that same heavy, deliberate sound. Tick, it gets hungry. Talk. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trying to finish updating the charts. I'd type a line about patient 207's blood pressure, and my mind would drift back to the look in Mrs. Lanchester's eyes. That flash of absolute, terrifying clarity. It was like the fog had lifted for just a moment, not to let her see the real world, but to let her see something else that was occupying the same space. I told myself it was textbook. The brain is a complex, fragile thing. When it starts to break down, it can create incredibly vivid, specific delusions. A shadow in the corner that gets hungry? It was probably a manifestation of her own fear, her own loneliness, her own body failing her. The human mind is a master at creating monsters to represent the things we can't face. I learned that in Psych 101. It made perfect sense. It was logical, but logic has a hard time standing up against a cold dread that starts in your stomach and works its way up your spine. Every time I looked up from my monitor, my eyes would automatically be drawn down the long, dim hall toward room 204. The yellow night lights seemed weaker now, the shadows between them deeper, darker. I kept thinking I saw movement in my peripheral vision, a flicker of motion at the far end of the corridor. Each time, I'd snap my head up, my heart giving a painful little kick in my chest, and there would be nothing. Just the still, silent hallway and the polished linoleum floor reflecting the weak lights like pools of stagnant water. I got up and made another pot of coffee, even though the last cup was still half full on my desk. I just needed something to do, an excuse to move around, to break the spell. The break room was cold, the hum of the old refrigerator the only sound. I focused on the mundane task, tearing open the filter packet, scooping the grounds, pouring the water. Normal things. The smell of the coffee brewing was reassuringly normal. See? Everything is fine. You're a professional nurse on a quiet night shift. You are in control. I took the fresh, steaming mug back to my desk and sat down. The warmth felt good in my hands. I took a sip. It was still sludge, but at least it was hot sludge. I glanced at the clock. 2:32 a.m. It had been almost 35 minutes since I'd left her room. The building had settled back into its deep, slumbering quiet. The unease was finally starting to fade, being replaced by a more familiar enemy, exhaustion. My brain was starting to feel fuzzy again, this time from a lack of sleep, not from fear. I managed to finish another patient's chart. I was starting to think I'd just overreacted. It was my first night alone, after all. My nerves were probably just on edge. That's when the light on the panel flashed again. It wasn't the slow, steady pulse from before. This time, it was frantic. A rapid, panicked flashing, accompanied by a sound that wasn't a polite request, but a desperate alarm. Beep 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 beep. It was sharp, incessant, and it sliced through the quiet like a scream. The red light was flashing next to the same number. 204. My blood ran cold. I was out of my chair before I even made a conscious decision to stand up. My half-finished coffee sloshed over the rim of the mug, spilling across the desk and onto the floor, but I didn't even notice. All I could hear was that frantic beeping and the sudden, violent thumping of my own heart. Something was wrong. This wasn't a bad dream. This was terror. I ran down the hallway. My soft-soled shoes, which had seemed so loud before, were now silent against the floor as I practically sprinted. The door to room 204 was slightly ajar, just as I'd left it. I pushed it open without knocking. Mrs. Lanchester? The scene inside was worse than I could have imagined. She wasn't sitting on the edge of the bed this time. She was pressed as far back against the headboard as she could get, her knees drawn up to her chest. She had pulled the thin blanket around her like a shield. Her eyes, wide with pure, undiluted fear, were locked on the doorway where I stood. Her roommate in the other bed was still fast asleep, blessedly oblivious, a soft snore rumbling from her. I rushed to her bedside and hit the button on the wall to silence the alarm. The sudden quiet was somehow worse, filled only by the sound of Mrs. Lanchester's ragged, shallow breathing. "It's okay, it's me, Anne," I said, my voice coming out breathier than I intended. "What is it? What's wrong?" She didn't seem to recognize me for a second. She just stared, her knuckles white where she clutched the blanket. Then, she reached out a trembling hand, not to grab me, but just pointing a shaky finger toward the hallway behind me. It was her voice that really got to me. The strange, articulate clarity was gone. It was replaced by a choked, desperate whisper, a voice tight with panic. It's hungry, nurse, she gasped, her whole body shaking. It's so hungry. I tried to use the same soothing technique as before, but my own words sounded hollow in my ears. Okay, we'll get it some food, then. But you're safe, okay? I'm right here. Nothing can hurt you. I was saying the words on autopilot, but I couldn't take my eyes off her face. This wasn't a delusion playing out in her mind. She was reacting to something. She was experiencing real, genuine terror. I made the mistake of glancing over at the corner of the room, the one she'd pointed to before. It was still empty, just a dark, unassuming corner. I started to turn back to her, to tell her that it was okay, that there was nothing there, when she grabbed the front of my scrubs with a strength I wouldn't have thought possible. She pulled me closer, her face just inches from mine, and then she said the words that I will never, ever forget. Her terrified eyes weren't looking at the corner anymore. They were looking past me, out into the hall. It's not in the corner anymore, she whispered, her voice cracking. It's out there, and it's looking at you. It's looking right at you, now. I froze. Every single hair on my body stood on end. A wave of ice and fire washed over my skin. It wasn't a figure of speech. I could physically feel my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It's looking at you now. Her words didn't feel like a hallucination. They felt like a warning. They felt like a statement of fact. Slowly, fighting every instinct that was screaming at me to just stay put, I turned my head and looked over my shoulder, back down the long, empty hallway toward the nurse's station at the other end. There was nothing there, absolutely nothing, just the same empty corridor, the same weak yellow lights, the same deep, motionless shadows. A perfect picture of institutional stillness. But I felt it. I can't explain it. It wasn't something I saw. It was a feeling, a pressure, the distinct, undeniable sensation of being watched. It was a physical weight on my skin, a prickling on the back of my neck that made me want to shrink into myself. The air in the hallway, which had just been still and warm, now felt charged, heavy, and intensely hostile. The silence was no longer empty, it was full. It was the silence of a predator that has gone still, waiting for its prey to make a move. The shadow she was talking about, it wasn't just a patch of darkness in her room. I felt it, then. It was the entire hallway. It was the sum of all the dark, unlit spaces, and it was focused entirely on me. I tried to swallow, but my throat was completely dry. I gave Mrs. Lanchester's hand a squeeze I hoped was reassuring, though my own hand was trembling. I need to go back to the desk, I whispered, my voice a strained rasp. I'll be right back. I backed out of the room slowly, never taking my eyes off the far end of the hall. Every step felt like walking through thick mud. The feeling of being watched intensified with every foot of distance I put between myself and the relative safety of her room. It felt like a pair of unseen eyes were following my every move, boring into the back of my head. I wanted to run, to sprint back to the relative light of the nurse's station and throw myself under the desk. But I couldn't. My feet felt like lead, and some part of my brain was screaming that any sudden movement would be a fatal mistake. When I finally reached the nexus where the two halls met, I risked a final glance back toward room 204. Nothing had changed. It was just an empty, silent corridor. But the feeling was still there, a malevolent presence that was just beyond the range of my senses. I practically fell into the chair at the station, my whole body shaking. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my ribcage. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stop the trembling. It's just your mind, Anne. She got to you. You're tired, you're spooked. It's a trick of the light and an overactive imagination. I kept repeating it to myself, a desperate mantra against the creeping fear. My eyes darted around, from the long hallway to my left, to the shorter, darker one to my right that led past the break room and toward the kitchen and the locked supply pantry at the very end. Everything was still, everything was silent, or so I thought, as I sat there, straining my ears, listening to the hum of the building and the frantic hammering of my own pulse. I heard it. It was a sound so small, so insignificant, that I almost dismissed it as my imagination. It came from the end of the dark hallway to my right. From the direction of the kitchen. It was a single, soft, metallic sound. Click. It wasn't a loud noise. It wasn't a creak or a groan or a bang. It was quiet, precise, and clean. It was the unmistakable sound of a bolt, or a latch, being carefully and deliberately disengaged from the inside. The kind of sound a locked door makes when it becomes unlocked. The sound just hung there in the silence. Click. It wasn't a building sound. You get used to the sounds a big, old building makes at night. The groans of the pipes, the shudder of the HVAC system kicking on, the settling of the foundation. Those are all part of the building's sleepy breathing. This was different. This was small, sharp, and intentional. It was the sound of a mechanism, a piece of metal moving against another piece of metal. It was a human sound, and it had come from the dark hallway to my right, the kitchen hallway. For a long 10 seconds, I did absolutely nothing. I just sat there, frozen in my chair, every muscle in my body clamped tight. My brain was a frantic, staticky mess, trying to process what I just experienced in room 204 and connect it to this new, tiny, terrifying piece of data. It's out there, and it's looking at you. Mrs. Lanchester's words echoed in my head, but they felt less like a hallucination now and more like a play-by-play commentary. My mind raced, trying to supply a logical explanation. It had to be the industrial ice machine, or the walk-in freezer compressor cycling off. It had to be. It was just a noise. An unfamiliar noise on my first night alone, amplified by a spooky old lady and a serious lack of sleep. That's all it was, but I couldn't make myself believe it. The sound wasn't a hum or a groan. It was a click, the kind of sound a latch makes. You have to understand, part of being a nurse is responsibility. It's hardwired into you. If you hear something strange, you can't just ignore it. You can't just hope it goes away. What if it's a patient who's gotten up and wandered off? What if someone fell? My professional training was at war with every primal survival instinct screaming at me to stay put, to hide under the desk, to not, under any circumstances, go toward the dark. The professional won, barely. I stood up, my legs feeling like they were filled with wet sand. Getting out of the chair felt like the hardest physical task I had ever performed. The little bit of light from the nurse's station seemed to cling to the area right around my desk, a tiny island of safety in an ocean of darkness. The hallway to my right was a black hole. It was shorter than the main resident corridor, maybe only 50 feet long, but it looked like a tunnel with no end. It went past the small break room, then the kitchen, and ended at the supply pantry. The pantry where they kept bulk dry goods and extra canned food. The pantry that was, I knew for a fact, always kept locked with a big, heavy-duty padlock. I didn't turn on the main hallway lights. You're not supposed to unless there's an emergency. It can wake up the residents. So, I was stuck with the dim, spaced-out yellow nightlights. They did more to create long, distorted shadows than to actually illuminate anything. Taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm my hammering heart, I started walking. My soft-soled shoes, usually so quiet, seemed to roar in the silence. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Each step was an announcement. I'm here, I'm coming. The feeling of being watched, the one that had gripped me outside of room 204, came back with a vengeance. It felt like the shadows themselves were leaning in, listening to my approach. I kept my arms hugged tight to my chest, my eyes darting from one dark corner to the next. The doorway to the empty break room looked like a gaping mouth. I hurried past it, my gaze fixed on the entrance to the kitchen at the end of the hall. The air grew colder as I got closer. The kitchen was always kept cooler than the rest of the floor. When I finally reached the doorway, I paused, listening. Nothing, just the low, steady hum of the big refrigerators. A familiar, comforting sound. Hello? I called out, my voice a weak croak. It got swallowed up by the humming. No answer. I reached inside the doorway and flicked on the kitchen lights. The harsh, white fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, buzzing loudly for a second before settling down. They flooded the room with sterile, shadowless light. It was a shock after the dimness of the hall. Everything was clean, gleaming stainless steel. Counters wiped down, dishes from the evening snack run put away, the big coffee urn sitting clean and empty. It was perfect, a picture of normalcy. See? I told myself, a wave of relief so powerful it made me dizzy washing over me. Nothing. It was the ice machine. Or the pipes. It was nothing. You're just scaring yourself, Anne. I was about to turn around and walk back to the safety of my desk, laughing at my own foolishness. I was already forming the words in my head to chastise myself. And that's when I saw it. My eyes followed the far wall, past the refrigerators and the double sinks, to the very back of the kitchen. And there it was, the pantry door. It was a heavy, solid wood door, reinforced with a metal plate around the handle. And next to the handle was a thick, steel hasp, the kind you lock with a padlock. The padlock itself, a big, brass master lock, was there. It was hanging open from the hasp, dangling uselessly against the wood. And the door itself, the door was ajar. Not wide open, just cracked. A sliver of pure, solid blackness, no more than an inch wide, ran from the top of the door to the bottom. My blood turned to ice. All the relief I'd felt just a moment before evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged terror that was very, very real. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't a feeling. This was a physical fact. A locked door was unlocked. A closed door was open. Once again, my brain scrambled for a rational explanation. It had to be the day shift. Someone from the kitchen staff, maybe Brenda in the morning, must have unlocked it to get something and forgot to lock it back up when she left. That had to be it. It was careless, sure, a breach of protocol, but it was a human mistake. It wasn't something else. It couldn't be. I forced my feet to move, one step at a time, across the cold tile floor. The hum of the refrigerators seemed to get louder, buzzing with a nervous energy that matched my own. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the cool metal of the handle. I hesitated. What if Brenda hadn't forgotten? What if the click I heard was the sound of the bolt being slid open from the inside? Stupid, I whispered to myself. You're being stupid. I had to know. I had to be sure. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, my fingers fumbling with the screen to turn on the flashlight. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I gently pushed the door open. It swung inward without a sound, revealing a wall of complete and total darkness. The air that wafted out was cool and smelled of old paper, dried beans, and something else, something faintly metallic and musty, like old, damp earth. I aimed my phone's flashlight beam into the void. The narrow beam cut a nervous, shaking circle in the dark. It slid over tall metal shelves stacked high with huge cans of tomato sauce, bags of rice, boxes of pasta. Sacks of flour and sugar were piled on pallets on the floor. I swept the light from left to right, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The pantry was narrow but deep. The beam danced along the shelves, deeper and deeper into the blackness. I saw nothing, no one, just shelves and food, bags and boxes. After what felt like an eternity, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My shoulders sagged. It was nothing. It was empty. Brenda just forgot to lock it. That's all. I didn't step inside. No way. I just reached in, grabbed the edge of the heavy door, and pulled it shut. It closed with a solid, satisfying thump. Then I took the heavy brass padlock, swung the hasp over, and clicked it shut. I tugged on it twice, hard, to make sure it was secure. Locked. Safe. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door, closing my eyes. My whole body was shaking, a fine tremor born of adrenaline and fear. I felt weak, but also a little bit proud. I had faced the fear, investigated the noise, and secured the area. I had done my job. It was all a string of coincidences. A confused old woman's delusion, an old building's strange noises, and a careless employee forgetting to lock a door. Nothing more. I took one more deep breath, trying to force the calm back into my body. The worst was over. Now I could go back to the desk, maybe make another pot of coffee, and just get through the last few hours of this godforsaken shift. I was turning away from the door, a shaky sense of relief finally beginning to settle in my stomach. That's when it happened. It ripped through the quiet humming of the kitchen, so loud, so sharp, so utterly different from before that it felt like a physical blow. It was the call bell. From room 204, but it wasn't the slow, polite beep from the first two times. This was a continuous, frantic, unbroken shriek, a high-pitched, desperate alarm that didn't stop. Beep. It was the sound of pure, abject panic, a sound of someone who wasn't just scared, but was watching a nightmare unfold right in front of them. It was a scream, translated into electronics. And it didn't stop. It just kept going, a single, piercing note of absolute terror echoing through the silent halls of the nursing home. That sound, that continuous, electronic scream, it wasn't just a noise. It was a physical thing. It hit me in the chest and short-circuited my brain. All the half-formed theories, all the self-reassurance about an overactive imagination, it all just evaporated. You don't pull a call bell like that because you're confused or need a glass of water. You pull it like that when you're watching your own death approach. There was no thought. My legs were already moving before my mind caught up. I didn't grab a flashlight. I didn't think about protocol. I just ran. My soft-soled shoes, which had felt so loud just minutes before, were now silent against the roar of my own blood pounding in my ears. I half flew, half stumbled down the main corridor, my hands out in front of me as if to ward off whatever was ahead. The dim yellow emergency lights streaked past, smearing the darkness into long, monstrous shapes. Every darkened doorway I passed was a new source of absolute terror. Was something going to step out? Was it waiting for me? The feeling of being watched wasn't just a prickle on my neck anymore, it was a certainty. It was a heavy blanket of dread wrapped so tightly around me I could barely breathe. The alarm grew louder, more shrill as I got closer, a homing beacon of pure panic guiding me. I reached the door to 204. It was slightly ajar. I didn't hesitate. I slammed it open with my shoulder, the wood banging hard against the interior wall stopper. And the scene inside froze me in the doorway for a solid second. It was all wrong. Mrs. Lanchester wasn't sitting up straight anymore. She wasn't looking at the corner. She was huddled at the head of her bed, as far back against the wall as an old woman could get, the thin blanket pulled up to her chin. Her body was a tight, trembling knot, and her eyes, wide with a lucidity that was far more terrifying than any of her previous confusion, were fixed on the open doorway. On the hallway I had just run down. Her arm was out, her hand still clutching the red call bell cord, her knuckles white. But her other hand, a frail, trembling thing, was pointing. Not at the corner, not anymore. She was pointing straight past me, out into the hall. The electronic shriek stopped the moment I burst in, the system resetting. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was somehow worse. It was heavy, and it was listening. Mrs. Lanchester? What is it? What's wrong? I asked, my voice a strangled whisper. I took a step into the room, and she flinched, a tiny, terrified movement. Her eyes darted from the hallway to my face, and there was a desperate plea in them. A plea for belief. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, no sound coming out. Then she took a ragged, wet breath and the words came, not in a confused mumble, but in a low, raspy, urgent whisper that cut right through me. A whisper of pure, unadulterated fear. It's out, she breathed, her voice cracking. It's not in here anymore. It left. My heart, which was already hammering against my ribs, seemed to stop altogether. I could only stare at her, at that pointing, skeletal finger aimed at the empty corridor behind me. What left, Mrs. Lanchester? I managed to ask, though I was suddenly very afraid of the answer. She leaned forward just a fraction, her eyes never leaving the doorway. The shadow, she whispered, the words tumbling over each other in her haste to get them out. It got tired of waiting. It's looking for food. It went to find the food. Nurse, you have to be careful. It's out there now. It's really out there. And that was it. That was the moment. It was like a key turning a lock in my brain that I didn't even know was there. A series of horrifying, disconnected images flashed through my mind, snapping together into one single, perfect, terrible picture. Why ta da cho kai bong den o gok fong and toi chua? Her first question, ran rot den le thuong. No doi lam roy, no dang nin ko day. Her second warning, the feeling of being watched. The click I heard in the kitchen hallway. A small, sharp, intentional sound. A human sound. The pantry, the heavy, locked pantry door, inexplicably standing ajar. The brass padlock hanging uselessly from its hasp. The pantry full of food. It went to find the food. My breath hitched in my throat. My blood turned to ice water. The entire world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't a symptom of Alzheimer's. Not really. All of it. Every strange feeling, every creepy coincidence, every word she'd said, it was all real. There was a person in this building. A person who had been hiding in the corner of this old woman's room. A person who was hungry. A person who was now, as she said, out there. Somewhere between the pantry I had just locked and this very room. The hair on my arms stood straight up. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead and the back of my neck. I was alone on this floor. Entirely, completely alone with the residents, all of them sleeping and helpless behind their closed doors. And I was alone with it. The professional nurse in me was gone. Annihilated. There was only a 24-year-old girl on her first solo night shift, trapped in a silent, locked-down building with an unknown intruder. I wasn't the caretaker anymore. I was prey, and I had just walked right past it in the hall. It had watched me run. It had watched me barge into this room. And it knew I was here. It knew that I knew. I backed away from Mrs. Lanchester, slowly, my eyes locked on the open doorway behind me. I couldn't see anything but the dim, empty corridor, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt charged, electric with a hostile presence. The shadows weren't just shadows, they were hiding spots. My mind was screaming, a frantic, high-pitched internal monologue of pure panic. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? Call security? My phone was in my pocket, but the main security guard, a guy named George who was at least 70, was in a booth at the main gate, a 5-minute walk away. I couldn't scream. I couldn't wake the residents. It would cause mass panic, put them in danger. Could I make it back to the nurses' station? Could I lock myself in an office? I had to move. Standing here, I was a sitting duck. Stay here, Mrs. Lanchester, I whispered, my voice shaking so badly the words were barely intelligible. Don't move. Don't make a sound. I don't know if she heard me or understood. Her eyes were still fixed on the hallway, wide with the terror I now shared. I turned, my body stiff with fear, and took one slow, deliberate step back into the corridor. And then another. My plan, if you could call it that, was to get back to the nurses' station, grab the landline, and call 911. It was my only option. I just had to make it 50 feet down the hallway. 50 feet that now felt like 50 miles across a minefield. I was halfway there, moving silently, my back pressed against the wall, my eyes scanning every inch of the darkness ahead. The nurses' station, with its little pool of light, was an oasis of perceived safety. Almost there, just a little further, my heart was a wild drum against my ribs. The silence was absolute, suffocating. I was holding my breath, listening, straining to hear any sound, a footstep, a breath, anything. And then I heard it. It wasn't a soft sound. It wasn't a subtle click. It was a sudden, explosive noise that ripped through the silence and shattered my last shred of composure. It came from the direction I had just come from. From the kitchen. Crash. It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy metal pot hitting a tile floor, followed instantly by the clatter of other metal objects. A cascade of falling silverware, maybe a pan being knocked off a rack. And then, a sound that made me jump out of my skin. Smash. The sharp, echoing shatter of breaking glass. It was loud. It was violent. It was careless. The shadow was no longer hiding. It wasn't being quiet anymore. It was in the kitchen, the place I had been just moments ago, and it was tearing things apart. It had found the food, and it was having its dinner. For a full second, I didn't move. I just stood there in the middle of the hallway, listening to the echo of that crash die out. That noise, it wasn't a ghost sound. It wasn't my imagination working overtime. It was the most real, solid thing I'd heard all night. It was the sound of a person who had stopped trying to be quiet. A person who didn't care who heard them anymore. And that was somehow the most terrifying thing of all. My blood, which had been frozen solid just a moment ago, suddenly turned to fire. The nurse in me, the professional, was gone. The part of my brain that processed protocol and patient care just switched off. There was only one thought, one single, blindingly clear instinct that screamed louder than any alarm bell ever could: run. I didn't look back at Mrs. Lanchester's room. I couldn't. I just turned and bolted for the one spot of light in this whole godforsaken corridor, the nurses' station. It was my only sanctuary, the only place with a desk to hide behind and, more importantly, a landline phone. My cell phone felt useless, a fragile piece of glass. I needed a real phone, one connected to the wall, one that felt permanent and safe. My feet barely seemed to touch the floor. The hallway stretched out in front of me, a tunnel of dim, yellow light and deep, threatening shadows. Every dark doorway I passed was a gaping mouth, ready to spit something out at me. The sound of my own ragged breathing was deafening in my ears. I kept my eyes locked on the pool of light from the desk lamp at the station, treating it like a lighthouse in a storm. Just get there, just get to the light. I didn't dare look behind me. I didn't want to see if the shadow had come out of the kitchen. I could feel it, though. I could feel the space behind me vibrating with a new kind of energy. It was no longer watching, it was active. It was loose. I finally reached the station, skidding around the edge of the U-shaped counter and dropping down behind it. My knees hit the hard linoleum floor with a painful thud, but I barely felt it. I was a cornered animal, heart hammering, breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I pressed myself against the cheap wood of the desk, trying to make myself as small as possible. The counter was low, maybe chest high if I were standing, but hunkered down here, I was completely hidden. For now, silence. The violent noises from the kitchen had stopped. The building was once again submerged in that heavy, listening quiet. But this time, it was worse. Before, it was the silence of emptiness. Now, it was the silence of a predator that has stopped to listen for its prey. It knew I was here. It must have heard me run. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get my phone out of my pocket. I fumbled it, almost dropping it. The screen was too bright in the dimness, blinding me for a second. I swiped and tapped, my thumb stabbing at the screen until I found the contact for the front gate. George, please pick up. George, please, please, please. The phone rang once, twice. My entire body was vibrating with a terror so profound it felt like I was going to fly apart. Come on, George. He was old, probably half asleep watching some black and white movie in his little security booth. Gate, a tired, gravelly voice answered. George, I breathed, my voice a strangled whisper. I couldn't speak any louder. I was terrified of being overheard. It's Anne. Floor 2. You have to call the police. Right now. Anne, what's going on? Speak up, I can barely hear you. There's someone in here, I whispered, forcing the words out. My eyes were glued to the entrance of the dark hallway that led to the kitchen. There's an intruder, in the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't a flicker, it wasn't a trick of the light. A shape detached itself from the absolute blackness of the kitchen corridor. It was a man. He moved without a sound, a deeper patch of darkness resolving into a human form as he stepped into the faint glow of the main hall's emergency lighting. He was tall, and thin, so thin he looked like a skeleton draped in filthy, dark clothing. His hair was matted and long, hanging over his face. He stood there for a moment, head cocked, as if listening. He was exactly where I had been standing just a minute before. He knew I was close. Anne, what's he doing? Anne, talk to me. George's voice buzzed frantically from the phone in my hand. I couldn't answer. I couldn't make a sound. My throat had closed up completely. The man in the hallway slowly, deliberately, turned his head in my direction. He scanned the empty hall, his gaze passing right over the nurse's station. And then, he stopped. His head tilted. He must have heard George's tinny voice. He looked directly at the nurse's station. I couldn't see his eyes from this distance, but I could feel them. I could feel them lock onto my hiding place. He knew. He took a step forward. And another. He wasn't rushing. He was walking with a slow, unhurried gait that was 1,000 times more terrifying than a sprint. It was the walk of someone who knows they have all the time in the world. Who knows their prey is trapped. As he got closer, the faint light caught something in his right hand. A glint of metal. It was a small knife, a paring knife from the kitchen, its blade catching the yellow light. He held it loosely, casually, by his side, as if he were simply carrying a tool to go peel an apple. Anne, what's happening? I'm calling 911. George yelled through the phone. The sound, even as faint as it was, sealed my fate. The man's head jerked up. He was no longer just looking at the station, he was looking right at me. He knew exactly where I was. He raised the knife slightly, not in a threatening gesture, but just acknowledging it. Acknowledging me, and he kept walking. My mind went completely blank. Primal fear, cold and sharp, stabbed through my chest. I jerked back in shock, and the phone slipped from my sweaty, trembling grasp. It clattered onto the linoleum floor. The line went dead. The last link I had to the outside world was gone. I was alone. He was 20 feet away now. 15. The soft, rhythmic scuff of his worn-out shoes on the floor was the only sound in the universe. Scuff, scuff, scuff. A death march coming for me. My back was pressed hard against the cabinets. There was nowhere to go. This was it. This was how it ended. A stupid, pointless death on my first night shift, cowering behind a desk. My eyes, wide with panic, darted around the small, enclosed space behind the counter. A filing cabinet, a trash can, a swivel chair, nothing, useless. Wait, there, on the wall, just to my right, mounted on a bracket. A splash of brilliant, solid red in this world of yellow gloom and black shadows. A fire extinguisher. It was like my brain didn't even have to think. It was a purely physical reaction. As the man's shadow began to fall over the edge of the counter, as he took the last few steps that would bring him around the side, my body moved on its own. I lunged to the side, my hands grabbing the cold, heavy cylinder. It was heavier than I expected. I wrestled it from its bracket with a loud metallic scrape. He heard it. His pace quickened. He was at the edge of the counter now. I could see his face. Gaunt, pale, with eyes that were just black, empty pits. A horrifying, vacant look. There was nothing behind them. I ripped at the pin, my fingers clumsy and stupid. For a horrible, eternal second, it was stuck. He was rounding the corner. The knife was coming up. The pin came free. He was only a few feet away, reaching for me. I didn't aim. I didn't think. I just squeezed the handle with all the strength I had left in my body. There was a deafening roar, a violent eruption that was more powerful than I ever could have imagined. A massive, thick cloud of choking white powder blasted out of the nozzle, hitting him square in the face. It wasn't like in the movies. It was a physical, concussive force. He screamed, a high, thin, inhuman shriek of pure shock and pain. He dropped the knife, which clattered to the floor, and his hands flew to his face. He staggered backward, clawing at his eyes, blinded and choking. The white powder filled the air, a thick, acrid fog that smelled of chemicals and burned my throat. I didn't wait. I didn't look back to see if it had worked for long. The moment he screamed, the moment he was blinded, I was moving. I scrambled around the other side of the counter, my shoes slipping on the fine white powder that now coated the floor. I burst out into the open hallway, into the blizzard of chemical dust. My only thought was escape. The main stairs, the exit. I ran, my lungs on fire, my legs pumping furiously. I risked a single glance over my shoulder. Through the swirling white cloud, I could see his dark shape, doubled over, coughing and retching, still screaming that awful, gurgling scream. I turned back and ran harder, my gaze fixed on the heavy fire door at the end of the hall that led to the main stairwell. Almost there, just as my hand reached for the metal push bar on the door, a new sound cut through the air. It wasn't the screaming of the intruder. It was the thunder of heavy footsteps. Lots of them, coming up the stairs from below. The fire door burst open towards me, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought I was trapped. But then I saw them. Two brilliant, dancing beams of light from heavy-duty flashlights, cutting through the dusty air. And behind them, the familiar, stocky shape of George the security guard, and another, younger maintenance worker I vaguely recognized, both of them charging up the last few steps. "Freeze!" George yelled, his old voice cracking with adrenaline, his big flashlight fixed on the chaotic scene down the hall. Help had arrived, and as I collapsed against the wall, gasping for air, I knew the dinner was over. The first thing I really remember after the white dust was the light. Not the dim, sickly yellow light of the hallway, but a brilliant, sharp, dancing beam that cut through the chemical fog like a laser. It pinned the wheezing, doubled-over shape of the man down the hall. Then a second beam joined it. George and a maintenance guy, a younger guy named Carlos I'd seen a few times, were standing in the doorway of the stairwell, their heavy-duty flashlights out. They looked like they'd run up a mountain. "Freeze! Police are on the way!" George yelled, and his voice, usually so tired and gravelly, was stretched thin with adrenaline. It cracked on the last word. I was still pressed against the wall, my legs feeling like they were made of jelly. The roar of the extinguisher was still echoing in my ears, or maybe that was just the sound of my own blood pumping. The air was thick and tasted like chalk and poison. I coughed, a dry, racking sound that bent me over. The intruder was still making his own noises, a horrible, wet, gurgling sound as he tried to claw the powder out of his eyes and throat. He wasn't a shadow anymore. He was just a pathetic, flailing man covered in white dust, disarmed and blind. The scene felt like some kind of weird, slow-motion dream. George and Carlos moved cautiously down the hall, keeping their lights on the guy. Carlos was speaking into a walkie-talkie, his voice fast and clipped. I couldn't make out the words. I just slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, my back pressed against the cool plaster. My whole body was shaking, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in my bones. I wrapped my arms around my knees and just watched. It didn't take long for the real police to show up. The hallway, which had been a place of terrifying silence, was suddenly filled with noise. The squawk of radios, heavy boots on the linoleum, sharp commands. The flashing red and blue lights from outside pulsed through the windows at the end of the hall, painting everything in strokes of frantic color. They cuffed the man, who was still coughing, and hauled him away. It was all very professional, very loud, very fast. Someone, a paramedic I think, put a scratchy blanket around my shoulders. Someone else handed me a small paper cup of water. I just sat there on a chair they'd pulled out from the nurse's station, watching them secure the scene. The floor was a mess, covered in a fine layer of white powder, with a small, discarded paring knife lying in the middle of it like a dead bug. I had to tell the story 3 different times. First to the officers who arrived on scene, then to a detective who showed up a little later. My voice was hoarse. I kept having to stop to drink water. I told them everything, starting with the first bell from Mrs. Lanchester. She has Alzheimer's, I explained to the detective, a tired-looking man with graying hair named Miller. I felt stupid saying it, like I was telling him about a dream I had. She kept calling me, said there was a black shadow in the corner of her room. Said it was hungry. Detective Miller just nodded, jotting things down in his little notepad without looking up. He didn't react, which somehow made me feel even more foolish. She said he was watching me, I continued, my voice barely a whisper. And then the last time, she said he was out, that he'd gone to find food. That's when I heard the crash from the kitchen. Miller said, still writing. To him, I was sure, it was just the incoherent ramblings of a dementia patient. A weird, spooky coincidence. That's what I thought it was, too. I was just trying to be thorough, to give him every single detail of my night from hell. They took my statement, took pictures of the hallway, the kitchen, the fire extinguisher. The whole place buzzed with a low, official energy until the sun started to rise. The day shift supervisor came in early, her face a mask of shock and concern. She sent me home, but I couldn't leave. I just sat in the break room, drinking cup after cup of terrible coffee, waiting for I don't know what. I felt like if I left, the bubble of reality would pop and I'd be back in that dark hallway again. Around 7 in the morning, Detective Miller found me in there. He looked even more tired than before, but he had a faint, reassuring smile on his face. Well, Anne, he said, leaning against the doorframe, you can relax. We know who he is. I just stared at him, my coffee cup warming my trembling hands. His name is Daniel Cole. Escaped from the county lockup 4 days ago. Nonviolent offender, mostly breaking and entering, petty theft. Looks like he was just desperate. Starving, basically. He paused and then delivered the next part like he was just giving me a weather report. Funny thing is, he said he wasn't just breaking in tonight. He'd been in here for a while. I frowned. What do you mean, a while? He confessed to everything. Guess he was too tired to lie, Miller said with a shrug. Said he found a loose grate on the roof and got into the attic crawlspace. He's been living up there, right above the 2nd floor, for 3 days. My hands went cold. The coffee cup might as well have been a block of ice. 3 days. The words just hung in the air. Miller continued, oblivious to the fact that my world was tilting on its axis. He said he found an old service hatch in the ceiling of a storage closet at the end of the hall down there. Waited till it was dead quiet at night to sneak down and look for food in the kitchen. Said he'd been doing it for 2 nights already. You were just the first person to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He gave me another tired smile. You were very brave, what you did. A lot of people would have just frozen. You probably saved your own life. I barely heard him. I was no longer in the break room. I was back in the night, replaying every single word Mrs. Lanchester had said to me. The storage closet with the service hatch. It was right next to her room. Room 204, the shadow in the corner of the room. It wasn't a random corner. It was the corner adjacent to the storage closet. The place he would have emerged from. The place he would have retreated to. Wai ta da cho kai bong den o gok fong and toi chua? Has the nurse fed the black shadow in the corner yet? Nyan len wai ta oi, no doi lam roy. Hurry nurse, he's very hungry. No dang nin ko day. He's watching you. No ra wai roy. No di tim doin' that roy. Can than. He's out now. He's really gone to find food. Be careful. A wave of nausea washed over me so powerful I had to grip the edge of the table. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a symptom. It wasn't a sick old woman's mind playing tricks on her. It was a goddamn eyewitness testimony. I finally understood. Alzheimer's hadn't made her see things that weren't there. It had just stripped away the part of her brain that filters things out. The part of the brain that tells you, that's just a trick of the light, that's just the pipes making noise, there's no reason for a man to be standing in the corner of your room, so just ignore it. Her mind, in its fractured state, didn't rationalize. It didn't dismiss. It just saw what was there. A dark shape in the corner. A hungry man. A predator. For 3 days she had been lying in her bed, the only person in the entire building who was seeing the plain, simple, terrifying truth. And we, all of us, the professionals, the sane ones, we had patted her hand and told her she was confused. We had explained away the monster in her room while it was listening to our every word. We had treated her warning not as a plea for help, but as a problem to be managed. Detective Miller said something about finishing up paperwork, and then he was gone. I sat there for a long time, the cold coffee forgotten in my hands. The horror of the night wasn't the man with the knife anymore. That was just simple, animal fear. The real horror, the one that was sinking into my marrow and would stay there forever, was the thought of Mrs. Lanchester. Lying there in the dark, night after night, watching the shadow emerge, knowing it was real, and having no one in the world believe her. When I finally stood up, my legs steady for the first time all morning, I walked out of the break room and down the now bright, clean, sunlit hallway. The police tape was gone, the powder was cleaned up. It looked completely normal. I stopped in front of room 204. The door was closed. She was probably sleeping. Maybe they'd given her a sedative to calm her after all the commotion. I had survived. I was the one they were calling brave. But she was the one who had tried to save me. She was the sentinel, and I had told her to go back to sleep, that the shadows weren't real. I looked at that closed door and felt a chill so profound it had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She wasn't seeing things. She was the only one in the whole damn building whose eyes were wide open.